is sentence variety? Variety means having different types. A verb we often use with variety is vary. Which paper has more variety, A or B? A, right? Your eye is drawn to A more because variety makes things interesting. This is the same with our writing. Let's look at some of my writing about my after work routine. After I get home, I say hello to my daughter and husband. After I change my clothes, we go for a walk. When we get home, my daughter eats dinner. While she eats, my husband prepares our dinner. Before we eat, we give my daughter a bath and put her to bed. As soon as she goes to bed, we eat dinner. How did that paragraph sound to you? To me, it sounds repetitive and boring because, for one thing, there's no variety. All of the sentences have the adverb clause first and the independent clause next. And this sameness can even cause people to stop paying attention. Also, every dependent clause is a time clause, so I only tell you what happens when, not how or why it happens. Let's make sure that this doesn't happen to you in your writing. Here are some tips for sentence variety. 1. Vary your sentence types and patterns. 2. Vary the types of adverb clauses that you use. First, let's talk about sentence types and patterns. Earlier in this course, you learned that there are 3 very basic types of sentences. Simple sentences have 1 subject-verb group. Compound sentences have 2 subject-verb groups joined by a comma and a coordinating conjunction, like and complex sentences have 2 subject-verb groups, and one of the groups begins with a subordinating conjunction like because. Simple sentences have 1 subject-verb group that is an independent clause or an IC. They can be very simple, like I take a walk. They can have an extra phrase at the beginning, like in the evening. They can have a compound subject, like my husband and I, or they can have a compound subject and 2 verbs, like take and cook. They can look many different ways. But notice in the last sentence that although there are 2 verbs, they both go with the same subject, my husband and I. Because these subjects and verbs all go together as one subject-verb group, they are all simple sentences. Compound sentences are 2 independent clauses put together into one sentence with a comma and a word like and in between. And is a coordinating conjunction. These words that we often call fanboys. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Here are some examples of compound sentences. Or, but, or, yet, so. Here are some examples of compound sentences. Notice that there are 2 separate subject-verb groups with a comma and a coordinating conjunction in the middle. Each of these clauses in these sentences is independent. It can stand on its own as a sentence. By now, you're very familiar with this third sentence type because adverb clauses come in complex sentences. You know that they can look like this, with an independent clause first and a dependent clause second, or like this, with the dependent clause first and the independent clause second. These are the two basic types of complex sentences with adverb clauses. However, remember, we can also have a complex sentence with two dependent clauses. It starts with a dependent clause and a comma, continues with an independent clause, and ends with another dependent clause like this. When Emily gets home, she practices gymnastics because she wants to stand on her hands. Or, even though Emily loves gymnastics, she doesn't have much time to practice after she comes home from work. Writing a complex sentence with two adverb clauses is great because you can pack a lot of information into one sentence. Now, there's one more type of sentence that I want to tell you about. It's the compound complex sentence, and it always has three subject-verb groups. One pattern of compound complex sentence looks like this. There's a dependent clause first, then two independent clauses joined together with a comma and a fanboys coordinating conjunction, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Because this part of the sentence is compound and there's a dependent clause, it's both a complex and a compound sentence. Here's an example. When Emily gets home, she lifts weights, comma, and she rides her bike. The sentence can also look like this, with the compound part first. When Emily gets home, comma, she lifts weights, comma, and she rides her bike. Okay, we've learned about simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentence patterns. Wow, look at all those different ways to write a sentence. Let's look back at my boring paragraph. Every sentence is a complex sentence with a DC-IC pattern. Now, look at this. We have a DC-IC complex sentence, a complex sentence with two dependent clauses, an IC-DC complex sentence, a compound complex sentence, and a simple sentence. We have a variety of sentence types and patterns, so it's starting to sound smoother and more interesting. However, there's still a problem. Every adverb clause is a time clause. This leads me to my second sentence fluency tip. Vary the types of adverb clauses you use. Remember these? When you explain your details with different types of adverb clauses, you add variety to the ideas you describe. Here, I've taken a few activities, going outside and eating dinner, and I've added adverb clauses of purpose, reason, and condition to explain why and how I do these things. Now I'm starting to give you a lot more information about my routine. To review, we've seen a few important sentence variety tips. and how I do these things. Now I'm starting to give you a lot more information about my routine. To review, we've seen a few important sentence variety tips. In the next video, we'll practice together with this so that you can feel confident writing with a variety of sentence types. Writing with sentence variety, guided practice. In the last video, we reviewed these sentence types. Let's practice some exercises to help you familiarize yourself with the structure of these sentences so that you can write them with confidence. Let's take a moment to test your knowledge. Are these sentences simple or compound? Pause the video and think about it for a moment. Okay, sentence one is simple. Here's one subject-verb group with Emily as the subject. What about number two? It's also simple. One subject-verb group. Number three is a compound sentence with two subject-verb groups and a coordinating conjunction, but. And number four is simple. One subject-verb group. How about these? Are they simple? Compound, complex, or compound, complex? Stop the video and think about it. Okay, number one is complex because it has three clauses and two of them are dependent due to these subordinating conjunctions. Number two is compound because it has two subject-verb groups, a comma, and a coordinating conjunction. Number three has three clauses that are joined with both coordinating and subordinating conjunctions. That's a compound complex. And number four has one subject-verb group, so it's simple. I hope you did well, and if you didn't, you can practice more after this. Now, let's practice actually creating some sentences that you can use in this module's writing assignment, if you'd like. Simple, compound, and the first kinds of complex sentences are pretty easy. So, let's focus on complex sentences with two dependent clauses and both patterns of compound complex sentences. I'll give you some ideas for what you could write. Here is a complex sentence pattern. As soon as I get home, I blank because blank. Here we have a time clause and a reason clause. Here's my example. As soon as I get home, I hug my daughter because I'm so happy to see her after a long day away. Clause and a reason clause. Here's my example. As soon as I get home, I hug my daughter because I'm so happy to see her after a long day away. Now you try. Take a moment to think of a sentence about your routine. And if you'd like, you can pause for a moment and write it down. Here's another sentence. It has a time clause with a purpose clause. After we take a walk, I prepare my daughter's dinner so that she can eat at 6 o'clock. Now you try. Take a moment to think of a sentence about your routine. And if you'd like, you can pause for a moment and write it down. Here's another sentence. It has a time clause with a purpose clause. After we take a walk, I prepare daughter's dinner so that she can eat at 6 o'clock. Now you try. Think of a sentence about your routine, and if you'd like, pause and write it down. Finally, here's another possibility with a purpose clause and a reason clause. Unless it's a weekend night, my husband and I eat only a few squares of chocolate for dessert since we're trying to watch our weight. What Unless it's a weekend night, my husband and I eat only a few squares of chocolate for dessert since we're trying to watch our weight. What about you? These were three complex sentence patterns with two dependent clauses each. You can write other types of adverb clauses like this as well. But remember, don't use them all together in your writing, or it will start to sound repetitive. Spread them out throughout the paragraph. Now let's practice with some compound complex sentences. I put my daughter in her bed and my husband finished cooking before we sit down to a delicious vegetarian meal. Here, the compound part is first and the adverb clause is last. You try. Here, we start with an adverb clause of condition. Cooking before we sit down to a delicious vegetarian meal. Here, the compound part is first and the adverb clause is last. You try. Here, we start with an adverb clause of condition. Even if I'm exhausted. I read part of a novel before going to sleep, or I browse through a few magazine articles. Now you try with your own sentence. Before going to sleep, or I browse through a few magazine articles. Now you try with your own sentence. Okay, you've learned lots of patterns to use in your writing, and lots of types of adverb clauses. Now you're ready to practice on your own. You'll practice identifying sentence types, and you'll read my sample routine paragraph. Soon, you'll be able to write your own routine paragraph with excellent sentence variety.